Imagine the British Empire, late 17th, early 18th centuries. It's this growing giant, stretching across the globe.
Right.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a stack of sources looking specifically at the British colonies in North America. The period is 1660 to 1763.
A really crucial time frame.
Yeah, think of it as when the colonies really started coming into their own, but, always with Britain watching, or sometimes maybe deliberately not watching too closely.
That's a good way to put it.
Our mission, then, to kind of pull out the key nuggets from this material. We want to understand how these colonies developed, how they were tied to Britain, what forces were shaping life for everyone there, free, enslaved, British, Native American.
It's a complex picture.
Definitely. We'll look at how England expanded after its own turbulent times, how it tried and sometimes failed to control trade.
The Navigation Acts, yeah.
Exactly. And the impact of big political shifts in England, the really dark reality of the slave system, this emerging consumer culture.
And those powerful religious and intellectual movements sweeping through.
Right. The Great Awakening, the Enlightenment, and of course, the wars. The series of wars that ultimately redrew the map of North America.
And what's particularly interesting, I think, as you look at the sources for this period, is this tension.
Tension? How so?
Well, it's a time when the bonds between Britain and the colonies seems stronger than ever in many ways. But at the same time, you can see the seeds being planted for the split that's coming just, a few decades down the road.
So both things happening at once, strengthening and diverging.
Exactly. We'll try to unpack how that works.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Back in England first. The sources make it clear that before 1660, Britain itself had been through some serious, upheaval.
Well, absolutely. You had the English Civil War in the 1640s.
Leading to the execution of King Charles I.
Right, in 1649. And then that decade without a king, the English interregnum, with Oliver Cromwell in charge.
But Cromwell's rule, initially maybe welcomed by some, it became seen more and more as a kind of military dictatorship, didn't it?
It did. The sources suggest a growing dissatisfaction. People wanted stability, a return to something familiar after all that uncertainty.
So when Cromwell died, and his son couldn't really hold on to power,
the path was clear for a return to monarchy.
Which brings us to 1660, the Restoration. Charles II, the executed king's son, comes back to the throne. And this was apparently a big deal, celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic.
It really was. And a key point from the sources is Charles II's immediate focus, strengthening England's global power. It wasn't just about recovery at home. It was about active expansion overseas.
Asserting England on the world stage.
Precisely. And that ambition has a direct impact on North America.
Through creating new colonies, right? The Restoration colonies.
Charles II's strategy was to grant huge areas of land, these proprietary colonies, to individuals or groups who were loyal to him.
A way to expand the empire and reward his friends.
Pretty much.
So the big additions in this period, the sources say, were New York and New Jersey captured from the Dutch.
And Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, all established between the 1660s and 1680s.
Let's maybe zoom in on the Carolinas first. This grant was meant to secure the area south of Virginia, right? Bordering Spanish territory.
Right. Charles gave it to 8 of his supporters, his proprietors, in 1663.
But a really critical detail here is the influence from Barbados. Many early settlers, especially in South Carolina, came from there.
And Barbados was already a sugar colony, completely built on enslaved labor.
So they brought that system with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That connection is vital. South Carolina starts with chattel slavery, deeply embedded. They brought enslaved people. They brought the laws from Barbados, the infamous slave codes that treated Africans as property. Charlestown, later Charleston, founded 1670.
And the economy quickly followed suit. Rice and indigo, heavily reliant on enslaved labor, became dominant in South Carolina by the early 1700s.
To the point where, and this is striking in the sources, South Carolina actually had a black majority population by 1715 because of the sheer scale of the forced importation of Africans.
Wow. And North Carolina developed a bit differently.
Yeah, somewhat. More focused on tobacco, naval stores, tar, pitch, turpentine, and deerskins. Slavery was definitely there, but the economy wasn't quite as dominated by massive plantations initially. The two regions eventually split formally in 1729 due to political friction.
And all this expansion, of course, had devastating effects on the native population.
Terrible effects.
Yeah.
European diseases continued to decimate them. And they got pulled deeper into trade, often becoming dependent on European goods like guns, falling into debt, trading deerskins, and sometimes even captives.
Which led to conflict.
Inevitably. English settlers pushed on to native lands, and some traders acted predatorily, even taking native women captive over debts. The sources really emphasize the Yamasee War, 1715 to 1718.
Right, this was a major coalition of tribes trying to push the Europeans out.
Yeah, the Yamasee and others, they came very close to destroying the Carolina colonies. Ultimately, it was the Cherokee aligning with the English. It highlights both the desperation of the situation for the colonists and, tragically, the disunity among native groups that Europeans could exploit.
Okay, let's shift north now. New York and New Jersey. This was expansion by conquest.
Right, taking over the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Part of that bigger imperial rivalry, the Anglo-Dutch Wars.
Charles II gave it to his brother James, Duke of York, in 1664. Hence, New York.
The Dutch living there weren't exactly happy about it. There was even a brief moment in 1673 when the Dutch recaptured it, but English control was reasserted in 74.
And the Duke of York wasn't keen on local government initially?
No, he preferred more direct control. But the colonists pushed for representation, and eventually, in 1683, a local legislature met and passed the Charter of Liberties and Privileges.
Affirming those traditional English rights, trial by jury, representative assembly.
Yeah, important principles. But interestingly, the English kept some Dutch structures, like the patroonship system.
Which meant huge land grants for favored families.
Families like the Livingstons ended up controlling vast estates, hundreds of thousands of acres, huge power imbalances built in.
And New York City itself was already diverse.
Very diverse, even then. Dutch, English, French Huguenots, Jews, Puritans, Quakers, Anglicans, and a large enslaved population too, a real mix.
What about native groups there, the Iroquois?
The Iroquois Confederacy, the Five Nations, played a really skillful diplomatic game for a while. They maintained neutrality between the English and the French in the early 1700s, trading with both, trying to preserve their autonomy, a different strategy than we saw with the Yamasee.
Interesting contrast. Okay, Pennsylvania, founded 1681. This one's different again.
Very different. It's the largest proprietary colony, granted to William Penn by Charles II to settle a debt owed to Penn's father.
And Penn was a Quaker, the Society of Friends.
Right, and that religious identity shaped the colony's founding principles.
Quakers had some pretty radical ideas for the time, didn't they?
They really did. Belief in the inner light, a spark of divinity in everyone. They rejected predestination, pushed for social equality, using thee and thou for everyone, and they were pacifists.
Which got them into trouble elsewhere.
Big trouble. Persecuted in England and even executed in Puritan Massachusetts. So Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey became a haven for Quakers seeking peace and religious freedom.
So no official church in Pennsylvania.
No official church, and a level of religious tolerance that was quite unusual in English America at the time.
How did Penn attract settlers?
He offered land, 50 acres, for completing service, which meant a heavy reliance, especially early on indentured servants. It attracted a diverse group, not just from England, but Germans, Scotch-Irish, people looking for opportunity.
But there's a contradiction here, the sources point out, regarding slavery.
Yes, it's a stark one. While Quaker ideals emphasized equality, Philadelphia grew into a major port, and Quaker merchants were involved in the transatlantic slave trade.
Though some Quakers were troubled by it.
Yes, some were among the earliest critics of slavery and began abolitionist efforts. It's a real tension within the colony.
What about relations with Native Americans? Penn's pacifism must have played a role.
It did, initially. Penn made a real effort to deal fairly with the local Lenni Lenape, or Delaware people. He focused on buying land through treaties like the Covenant of Friendship and a treaty with the Susquehannocks.
So less frontier warfare in early Pennsylvania compared to other colonies.
Much less in the early years. That pacifist approach, at least under Penn himself, made a difference.
And we get these little glimpses into daily life from the sources, like that newspaper ad from 1722.
Right, the American Weekly Mercury ad looking for escaped prisoners. It mentions details about servants, their backgrounds. It really helps to picture the time.
Okay, so these colonies are developing, each with its own sort of character, but England wants them to serve the empire's bottom line. Enter mercantilism and the Navigation Acts.
Exactly. Mercantilism is this economic theory where you maximize wealth by controlling trade export more than you import, accumulate gold and silver. Colonies exist to enrich the mother country.
And the Navigation Acts were the tools to enforce this.
Precisely. A series of laws passed between 1651 and 1696.
What were the main rules?
Well, crucial ones were: only English ships could trade between England and the colonies. The crews had to be mostly English. And certain valuable goods, the enumerated articles like sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, could only be shipped to England or another English colony.
Cutting out foreign competition.
Right. And another key one, colonies generally couldn't import goods unless they were made in England. This gave English manufacturers a captive market.
There were even taxes on trade between colonies.
Yeah, the Plantation Duties Act of 1673 aimed at stopping, say, New Englanders from buying cheaper French molasses for their rum production by taxing intercolonial trade in those goods.
Did England try to enforce all this?
They set up bodies like the Lords of Trade, later the Board of Trade, and they introduced stricter measures in 1696, things like vice admiralty courts.
Those were the courts without juries.
Right, making it easier to convict smugglers. And they used writs of assistance, which were basically open-ended search warrants. Colonists really hated those.
But was it actually enforced effectively?
And here's the twist the sources highlight. For a lot of the 18th century, enforcement was surprisingly lax. This policy, often called salutary neglect, especially under Prime Minister Robert Walpole.
Salutary neglect, healthy neglect.
Kind of. The idea was that colonial commerce would thrive more and ultimately benefit Britain more if it wasn't overly restricted. Let sleeping dogs lie, perhaps.
So the laws are there, but often ignored.
Widely ignored in some cases. The Molasses Act of 1733, putting a high duty on foreign molasses, was a prime example. New England merchants kept smuggling cheaper French and Dutch molasses anyway.
What was the effect of this neglect?
Well, it meant that while colonists were technically under this restrictive system, they were also developing their own shipping, their own trade networks, learning how to navigate, sometimes skirt the rules, gaining a degree of economic autonomy.
So perhaps unintentionally training them in self-reliance.
You could certainly argue that. It created this interesting dynamic where they were part of the empire, but also developing their own way of doing things economically.
Okay, sticking with control and power shifts a huge event back in England, sends shockwaves across the Atlantic. The Glorious Revolution.
Right. This centers on King James II, Charles II's brother, who takes the throne in 1685.
And he had a different style.
A very different style. He admired Louis XIV of France, aimed for more absolute power. Crucially, he was Catholic, his wife was Catholic, and when they had a son, it raised the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty ruling Protestant England.
Which caused a lot of anxiety.
Huge anxiety. Plus, he kept a standing army in peacetime, which many saw as a threat to liberty.
And he applied this centralizing approach to the colonies, too.
Yes, with the Dominion of New England in 1686, he basically abolished the existing colonial charters in New England, later adding New York and New Jersey, and put them all under a single governor, Sir Edmund Andros.
And Andros wasn't popular.
Deeply unpopular.
Yeah.
The sources paint him as someone who ignored local assemblies, challenged land titles, imposed fees, cracked down on the Navigation Acts disrupting trade, and even promoted Anglican services in Puritan Boston. It felt like an assault on their rights and traditions.
So opposition built up in England.
Leading to the Glorious Revolution of 1688-1689. James II was overthrown, he fled to France, and Parliament invited the Protestant monarchs, William III and Mary II, James's daughter, to take the throne.
And when news reached the colonies,
it triggered uprisings there too. In Boston, colonists threw out the Dominion government and arrested Andros in 1689.
And in New York,
a man named Jacob Leisler led a revolt of Protestants against the Dominion officials, seizing control.
So they saw themselves as acting in support of the revolution.
Yes, but Leisler's actions went further. He organized military actions against the French, which some saw as overstepping, as usurping the crown's authority. He was eventually arrested by the new royal governor, tried for treason, and executed in 1691.
A complicated legacy there.
Very. But overall, the Glorious Revolution became this shared story, a heroic defense of English liberty against tyranny, celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic.
And it had lasting consequences back in England.
Absolutely. The 1689 Bill of Rights established England as a constitutional monarchy. It limited the monarch's power, asserted Parliament's independence, and guaranteed key rights for English subjects trial by jury, habeas corpus.
Which connects to Enlightenment ideas, like John Locke.
Perfectly. Locke's two treatises of government came out right around then, 1690. He argued government is a contract to protect natural rights, life, liberty, property, rejected divine right, emphasized limited government.
And those ideas found fertile ground in the colonies.
Immensely influential. It reinforced their belief in the importance of representation and their rights as Englishmen. It's foundational thinking for what comes later.
Was there a religious component to the settlement, too?
Yes, the 1689 Toleration Act. It granted freedom of worship to most Protestants, Baptists, Congregationalists, etc., though not Catholics. The Church of England remained established in many places, but it opened the door for greater religious diversity.
And that applied in the colonies.
It did. It reinforced the diversity already present, especially in colonies like Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Delaware, New Jersey, which didn't have an established church anyway.
Okay, so we've got the political framework, the economic system. Let's shift to life within the colonies, specifically the stark reality of slavery and this growing consumer culture.
It's impossible to understand the 18th century British Empire without understanding slavery. It wasn't just in the South, it existed in every single North American colony.
More than just labor.
Much more. The sources show how it shaped culture, ideas about race, and gave white colonists, even poor ones, a sense of status by defining themselves against the enslaved. It created a kind of shared white identity built on racial difference.
And the slave trade itself ramped up?
Dramatically. Charles II had created the Royal African Company with a monopoly in 1660. When that monopoly ended in 1689, the floodgates opened. Many more English merchants jumped in, and the number of Africans forcibly transported skyrocketed.
The journey, the Middle Passage.
Unspeakably brutal. The sources mention horrific death rates, maybe 20% on Royal African Company ships alone. Many survivors were shipped first to the West Indies, like Barbados, then sold again to the mainland colonies.
And the experience for those enslaved.
A constant nightmare of loss, violence, dehumanization, forced labor. But the sources also emphasize resilience.
How?
Enslaved people actively resisted. They formed new communities, blended traditions, preserved healing practices, built families, vital ways of coping with trauma. And there was overt resistance too, defying orders, running away.
Forming maroon communities.
Escaped slaves, creating their own hidden settlements, fighting to stay free, particularly in places like Jamaica.
And outright rebellion.
Yes, though the odds were terribly stacked against them. The sources focus on two major examples in this period. First, the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, 1739.
Led by Jimmy.
Yes, described as a literate Angolan. He led a large group, armed themselves, marched south, trying to reach Spanish Florida where freedom was promised. They killed white settlers along the way before the militia caught and crushed them.
What's that detail about Angola and Catholicism?
Some historians suggest Jemmy might have been from the Kingdom of Congo, which had exposure to Catholicism. It's speculated this shared background might have helped him organize rebels from different African origins, underlining the planters' constant fear of enslaved people finding common ground.
The aftermath was harsh laws.
Extremely harsh. South Carolina quickly passed the Negro Act of 1740. Severe restrictions, no assembling, no growing their own food, no learning to write, no traveling freely, clamping down hard.
Then, just 2 years later, panic in New York City. The conspiracy trials of 1741.
Right. NYC was diverse. Maybe 1 in 5 people were enslaved. Tensions were high, especially after Stono. Then a series of fires broke out.
And people suspected arson, a slave plot.
Rumors flew. A plot to burn the city, murder the white inhabitants. Hysteria took over, fueled by anti-Catholic fears, too.
What happened?
A brutal crackdown. Nearly 200 people, mostly enslaved Africans, were accused, often on flimsy evidence. Quick trials, mass executions, 17 people killed, 13 black men burned at the stake publicly. The map showing the execution sites is chilling. 70 more were sold off to the West Indies. Was there really a conspiracy?
The sources suggest there's little evidence of a grand, coordinated plot. It looks more like racial panic leading to horrific violence and reinforcing white control.
A terrifying example of fear driving injustice.
Okay, shifting from that grim reality, let's look at the other end of the social spectrum. The colonial gentry, the wealthy elite. Their rise was enabled by these labor systems, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Both indentured servitude and especially slavery created the wealth that allowed a colonial gentry class to emerge. They aimed to be genteel refined, like the English aristocracy.
And they showed off their status.
Oh, yes. Building grand houses, like
Yeah.
William Byrd II's Westover Plantation in Virginia. He's often cited as an example, wealthy planter, slaveholder, trying to live like an English lord.
And his secret diary gives us a look inside.
A remarkably frank look. It shows his daily life reading, managing his estate, his interactions with family, servants, and the enslaved people he owned.
Some entries are pretty disturbing, aren't they?
They are, mentioning nearly whipping a maid, denying permission to an enslaved man, cheating his wife at cards. And that horrifying entry about his wife burning an enslaved girl named Jenny with a hot iron and Byrd just quarreling with her about it. It reveals the immense power, the casual cruelty, the complex dynamics of that world. The visual of the Westover staircase hints at the wealth built on this system.
This gentry class and others too were increasingly connected to Britain through stuff, goods.
Yes, the consumer revolution. In the 18th century, there was a huge increase in the availability of British manufactured goods in the colonies.
Things like furniture, ceramics, textiles.
And buying these goods created a tangible link to Britain. It fostered what some call a shared community of taste and ideas. Tea is a great example. It became massively popular, the drink of the empire, consumed by all classes, even if the rituals differed.
Printed materials were part of this too.
A huge part. Newspapers became common after the 1680s. Pamphlets, journals, books from Britain circulated widely.
Like what kind of publications?
Things like Cato's letters. These were Whig political pamphlets arguing for liberty, warning against tyranny. And magazines like The Spectator, which aimed to cultivate refined taste and manners. Even novels, a new form then, like Defoe's Robinson Crusoe or Richardson's Pamela, were popular reading across the British Atlantic.
Providing a shared culture.
Exactly. Shared reading, shared tastes, shared political ideas, all reinforcing their identity as Britons, even across the ocean.
Beyond goods and print, there were also major intellectual and religious currents flowing across the Atlantic.
Two huge ones in this period. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. Both strengthened ties to Britain in different ways.
Let's start with the Great Awakening. This was a religious revival.
Yes. The First Great Awakening, an 18th century wave of Protestant revivalism. It emphasized emotional, personal religious experience over formal rituals or strict doctrine.
Who did this appeal to?
It often appealed to those who felt left out by the established churches, women, younger people, those lower down the social ladder. It led to conflict, too, splits between the new lights who embraced the revival and the old lights who rejected it.
Any key figures?
Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts is famous for his intense sermons, like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The title alone tells you something. His sermons were printed and spread the revival.
And George Whitefield.
He was probably the biggest figure, an English preacher, an amazing orator who traveled throughout the colonies, drawing enormous crowds. The illustrations we have show both admiration and satire. He clearly provoked strong reactions.
Did it change the religious landscape?
Significantly.
Right.
New denominations like Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians gained many converts, challenging the older groups like Anglicans and Congregationalists. But it also created a shared transatlantic religious experience for thousands.
Okay, then the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. Different vibe entirely.
Completely different. This was an intellectual and cultural movement focused on reason, science, observation, and individual rights, pushing back against superstition and unquestioned authority.
Thinkers like Locke, Newton.
Their ideas spread through print, encouraging rational thought, empiricism, learning through experience, and a belief in progress. Cosmopolitanism, too, seeing oneself as a citizen of the world, guided by reason.
Were there organizations promoting this?
Yes. The Freemasons became quite prominent. A fraternal society that started in London coffee houses, advocating Enlightenment ideals like tolerance and inquiry. They established lodges in the colonies.
And the prime example of the Enlightenment figure in America
Has to be Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
The sources really highlight him. Boston-born, runs away to Philadelphia,
Yeah.
becomes a successful printer, publisher. Poor Richard's Almanac full of practical wisdom. His portrait shows him as a successful cosmopolitan figure.
He was also a deist.
Yes, believing in a creator God, but one who doesn't intervene. Morality and reason were key for deists like Franklin. This fueled his civic-mindedness.
Founding institutions.
So many. The Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, the Foundations for the University of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Hospital, promoting knowledge and public good.
Plus his scientific work.
Right, famous experiments with electricity, inventing the lightning rod, published internationally. His memoir, The Rags to Riches Story, also became incredibly influential, sort of laying the groundwork for the American dream idea. The map of his influence really shows his reach.
Did Enlightenment ideals influence colony founding, like Georgia?
Georgia's an interesting case, founded in the 1730s by James Oglethorpe, a British MP and reformer who was appalled by debtors' prisons. He got a charter for a colony for England's worthy poor.
Strategic location, too.
Yes, a buffer against Spanish Florida. Oglethorpe had this Enlightenment vision, a planned utopian agrarian society in Savannah emphasizing equality. Initially, he even banned slavery and alcohol.
Did it work?
Not really. The reality of colonial life and pressure from settlers coming from other colonies undermined the bans. By the 1750s, Georgia was producing rice with enslaved labor, just like South Carolina. The ideals kind of crashed against economic pressures.
A telling example. Okay, finally, we have to talk about the almost constant warfare that looms over this whole period.
The wars for empire. Britain, France, and Spain were locked in power struggles pretty much continuously from 1688 to 1763.
And these European conflicts spilled over into North America.
Absolutely. They were fighting for control of the continent. And Native American groups were essential players, forming alliances with different European powers, often shaping the course of the fighting.
What was warfare like then?
Pretty brutal, often seasonal campaigns. British Army discipline was incredibly harsh, as sources like Captain David Perry's diary describe. Recruits were often from the poorest classes. Fear of officers was intense. Those bright uniforms and rigid formations mask a grim reality.
There was a whole series of these wars.
Yes, often with different names in Europe and America. King William's War in the late 1600s, mostly fighting between New England and New France, kind of inconclusive. Then Queen Anne's War, early 1700s.
What happened in that one?
England fought France and Spain. There was fighting down in Florida, up in New England and Canada. Britain gained territory like Acadia, but failed to capture Quebec. It included awful events like the Deerfield Raid in Massachusetts in 1704.
The French and native attack on the frontier town.
Yeah, many killed, over 100 captured, including Eunice Williams, the minister's daughter, who famously assimilated into Mohawk society and chose not to return.
Then the bizarrely named War of Jenkins' Year.
Right, 1739, 1742. Britain versus Spain, mostly focused on the contested land between South Carolina and Florida. Georgia's buffer role was key here. Named after a British captain who supposedly had his ear cut off by the Spanish years earlier, it mainly disrupted trade.
In King George's War.
Mid-1740s.
Right.
More fighting in the north. The big event was the capture of the huge French fortress at Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island by colonial and British forces in 1745, a massive victory, captured in paintings.
But they had to give it back.
Exactly. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 returned Louisbourg to France. Colonists were furious after all their effort. It felt like an incomplete victory, setting the stage for more conflict.
Which brings us to the big one, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War globally, 1754-1763.
This was the decisive contest for North America.
Sparked by conflict in western Pennsylvania, Ohio Valley.
Right. Rival claims between the French, who were building forts like Fort Duquesne, where Pittsburgh is today, and Virginia planters organized as the Ohio Company, who had crown grants to the land and wanted to expand.
And it starts with George Washington.
Literally. May 1754, a 22-year-old Washington, involved with the Ohio Company, leads a small force and orders them to fire on French soldiers. That incident ignites the war.
The early years were bad for the British.
Really bad. Washington had to surrender his hastily built Fort Necessity. General Braddock's large force was ambushed and routed in 1755. Braddock killed. Key forts like Oswego and William Henry fell to the French. The map showing those early defeats is pretty stark.
What turned the tide?
A couple of things. From 1758 onwards, William Pitt back in Britain poured enormous resources, money, troops into the war effort. Offering bounties also helped boost colonial recruitment.
And native alliances shifted.
Critically, the Iroquois, Delaware, and Shawnee signed the Treaty of Easton in 1758, agreeing to side with the British, partly based on promises about limiting settlement west of the Appalachians after the war, a promise that would soon cause problems.
And this led to British victories.
Yes. They captured Louisbourg again, took Quebec in that famous battle in 1759, then Montreal in 1760. The French Empire in North America effectively collapsed.
So the war ends in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. What were the results?
A total game changer. France lost virtually all its territory in North America. Britain gained Canada and everything east of the Mississippi River, except New Orleans. They also got Florida from Spain. Britain became the undisputed dominant European power on the continent, and really a global empire, gaining territory in the Caribbean, India, Africa too.
How did people react?
British subjects everywhere, including the American colonists, were ecstatic. They celebrated victory, saying, "Rule Britannia." Colonists felt immense pride in being British, having fought alongside the regulars to defeat their great rival France. Ties seemed stronger than ever. But there's always a but, isn't there?
Always. This massive victory came with a massive war debt for Britain.
Huge debt. And the efforts by Parliament in the 1760s and 70s to pay down that debt and manage this vast new empire involved new taxes and regulations on the colonies.
Imperial reforms that would cause major friction.
A very success that brought them together started to create the stresses that would eventually tear them apart.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, you really see how this period, 1660 to 1763, fundamentally shaped British North America. Ties to Britain were definitely strengthening new colonies. Trade rules, even if bent, shared political ideals from the Glorious Revolution, cultural waves like the Awakening and Enlightenment, and that shared victory in war.
Yeah, they saw themselves as British. But at the same time, the colonies developed their own unique characteristics. Regional differences, massive diversity, that incredibly problematic reliance on enslaved labor driving wealth and division, and, as we discussed, a growing economic self-reliance, almost by accident.
So it's this complex mix. 80 years or so of growth, integration into the empire, colonial identity solidifying as British.
And yet, it's precisely at this high point of imperial unity and pride after the victory over France that things start to unravel. It's fascinatingly ironic.
So the big question to leave people with: how could the very war that made Britain a global superpower and filled colonists with pride in being British also contain the seeds of the revolution that would tear that relationship apart just over a decade later?
That's the paradox, isn't it? How victory and shared identity could so quickly curdle into conflict. Something to definitely chew on.